Welcome, everyone. My name is Maris Kreisman, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event at McNally Jackson. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions, so start thinking about them now. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we weathered the pandemic and reopened all 4 of our locations for browsing and shopping, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll be posting links in the chat to buy Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again from McNally Jackson. And so it's such a pleasure to welcome Katherine Angel all the way from London, where it is midnight, and to have Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore here to join her from Seattle, where it's 4 p.m. So we're really spanning the globe tonight, and that's really exciting. Katherine Angel is a writer and lecturer in creative writing at Birkbeck University of London, and the author of Unmastered, a book on desire, most difficult to tell, and daddy issues. Her writing and research focus on sexuality, psychiatry, feminism, and gender in the 20th and 21st centuries. She has a PhD in the history of psychiatry and sexuality from the University of Cambridge's History and Philosophy of Science department. Such a pleasure to have her here tonight to celebrate the American launch of Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. And Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore is here, most recently the author of The Freezer Door, longlisted for the 2021 Penn Jean Stein Book Award and one of Oprah Magazine's best LGBTQ books of 2020. She's also the author of 3 novels and a previous memoir, The End of San Francisco, which won a Lambda Literary Award. Her novel Sketch to See was one of NPR's best books of 2018, and her next anthology, Between Certain Death and a Possible Future, Queer Writing on Growing Up with the AIDS Crisis, will be out in October. Welcome to both of you. And Katherine, if you would like to begin with a little reading.
Sure. Hi, thanks for having me. So I'm going to read just from the first kind of couple of pages of the book. Sometime in the early 2010s, the porn actor James Dean made a film with a fan whom he called Girl X. He would do this now and then. Fans would write to him wanting to have sex with him, or he would put out a call to do a scene with James Dean, and the results would go up on his website. In an interview in April 2017, only a few months before the media would be overwhelmed with discussions of assault and harassment by Harvey Weinstein and others, and only 2 years after Dean himself was accused of, though not charged with, multiple assaults, he said, "I have a do a scene with James Dean contest where women can submit an application. And then after a very long talk and months of me saying, you know, everyone's going to find out, it's going to affect your future, and basically trying to talk them out of it, then we shoot a scene." Little of the Girl X video, in fact, involves sex. It's mostly a long, flirtatious, fraught conversation, which circles repeatedly back to whether or not they're going to do this, have sex, film it, and put it online. Girl X hesitates. She moves between playfulness and retreat. She is game, then agonized. She lurches ahead, then stalls. She is torn, reflective, and self-questioning. She thinks her dilemmas out loud, and Dean tries to follow along. She presumably wants to do a scene with James Dean, but when he opens the door to her, she appears to lose some nerve. She walks into the apartment dressed in PVC leggings, a buttoned-up silk cream blouse with black detail. Our gaze is behind the camera with Dean filming her. And she paces around in agitation, laughing a high-pitched, nervous laugh, saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." We catch glimpses of the space. It's generically anonymous, sparkling surfaces, lots of pale wood, and then glimpses of him as he puts the camera down, distressed jeans, big white trainers. He occasionally brings the camera up to her face. She turns away, He teases her, "You're a college girl, you're smart and shit," as they move back and forth in the kitchen with its gleaming central island, in the corridor with its bright white dado rails and deep red walls. He asks what she wants to be called. She doesn't answer. "Well," he says, "I'm going to call you Girl X until you decide what your name is." She's skittish, nervous, "I can't even look at you," moving away, moving in. She sits down at a shiny chrome table on a white bench. They discuss a contract. The footage fades out. It fades back in. She takes a selfie. She's about to sign, but then she stops and says, "What am I doing with my life? What the fuck am I doing with my life?" She can back out at any stage, he says. They can rip the contract up. More fading in and out. We see her sign. "We can figure out a stage name later," he says, "unless you just want to be Girl X." "I don't know," she says in a reluctant drawl. "I have no idea. I've never done this." Girl X's nervousness works to flatter Dean. It's a sign of her awe at meeting this huge, improbable star. But it also works to preempt any repercussions she may be fearing, to undermine what might be taken by Dean, by others, as exhibitionism, as asking perhaps for trouble. She's readying herself for exposure. Girl X is doing something geared towards the hungry gaze of others, something she imagines will excite and satisfy a spectator, including perhaps the one inside herself, the one who wants to watch herself having sex with Dean. But when she asks, "What am I doing with my life? What the fuck am I doing with my life?" I feel her imagining too the gaze of another kind of spectator, a sterner one, a censorious one. Both these spectators, the one egging her on and the one admonishing her, are most likely internalized within Girl X, as they are within many women. The spectator we are primed to satisfy, and the spectator whose disapproval and reprisal we're afraid to provoke. Girl X is reckoning with the spectators inside her head and with the power of spectacle itself. She is the impulsive seeker after pleasure, but she's also alienated, self-conscious, and inhibited. She veers between being unabashed and then wildly aware of the power imbalance between her and Dean. The stakes for her are high, and they make the decision to pursue her own desires immensely difficult to see through. These dissociative flickers, these changes of gear and register, they come precisely from the power of punitive ideas about women's sexuality and personhood. Girl X is grappling with questions that many women may ask themselves, that I have certainly asked myself, the first time they sleep with a man or the moment they reveal their desire. Will I be in danger? In revealing myself, have I foregone privacy? Will I be pursued, haunted by my own actions? Will I be able to resist the unwanted desires of others? Has saying yes precluded my ability to say no? When Girl X expresses her ambivalence, "I want to have sex with you," she says, "but I don't know if I want to show the world." Dean is receptive. "You don't want to be slut-shamed," he says. She carries on. Like, she says, adopting a blokey voice, "I saw you fuck him. Why don't you fuck me?" This is not an entirely paranoid thought. One of the accused in the 2018 so-called rugby rape trial in Northern Ireland, on entering the room where two other men were performing sex acts on her, and when she said no, allegedly replied, "You fucked the others. Why can't you fuck me?" A woman's presumed desire, even just once, for one man, makes her vulnerable. Her desire disqualifies her from protection and from justice. Once a woman is thought to have said yes to something, she can say no to nothing. In the film, there are many moments of laughter, joy, and pleasure. It's quite charming to watch. There's humor, playfulness, and teasing. Girl X and Dean seem genuinely to like each other. There's chemistry. And she punctures him, no longer awed, she's sarcastic and cutting. But there's awkwardness too, and mistimed movements, her ambivalence, his uncertainty. Eventually, they overcome the hurdles, they cross the threshold, and they have sex. They're sometimes noisy. There are silent stretches too, and pauses in the action. She sighs, they laugh, they chat. In as far as it's ever possible to know from the outside, and it's not, it looks pretty good, fun, joyous. They sit in silence for a while, smiling, then agree to go for a cigarette on the balcony. "You want me to turn the camera off?" he asks. "Yes," she says. "Okay," he says. She starts getting dressed. The camera goes off, he says. The camera goes off, she says. He walks towards the camera, towards us, the viewers. The camera, he says, will go off. We'll probably never know what happened after this, what happened in the breaks between the filmed sections, what was edited out, what conversations we didn't hear, what sex we didn't see. We'll probably never know what Girl X made of the allegations against Dean, or whether there were things that day that made her uncomfortable, that caused her sorrow or anger. I don't know Girl X's story. But in the film, I see the painful and familiar experience of being pulled in different directions, of having to balance desire with risk, of having to pay attention to so much in the pursuit of pleasure. Women know that their sexual desire can remove protection from them and can be invoked as proof that violence wasn't in fact violence. She wanted it. Girl X shows us that it's not only desire's expression, but its very existence that is either enabled or inhibited by the conditions in which it is met. How can we know what we want when knowing what we want is both demanded of us and a source of punishment? No wonder Girl X has mixed feelings, is paralyzed by uncertainty. James Dean understands none of the melancholic weight of sex for Girl X. He doesn't have to. Girl X, however, has grown up with impossible demands, and she is living out the double bind in which women exist, that saying no may be difficult, but so too is saying yes. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that amazing reading, Katherine. One of the things I was thinking, and I hadn't thought of this before, but I was thinking as you were reading that in a way that introductory anecdote is kind of mapping out the kind of texture of the book as a whole. So that feeling of kind of going in and out of focus, or that shift between softness and sharpness, and that sort of movement while at the same time of very like grounded stability. And I think in the book as a whole, there is it's so clear, your prose, that I think one could be misled, I'm going to assume, by reading it that it was even easy to write. And so I wondered if you might talk, because I know as a writer myself, I'm going to assume, but correct me if I'm wrong, but the hardest writing is the writing that seems the easiest in a way. And that to get to that place of a pared down text that contains all of those shifts at the same time is a very methodical art. And so I wondered if you want to talk a little bit about the process of getting to that point.
In short, it was torture. It's like it's always quite a long, slow process for me, I think. I mean, that opening scene, you know, the description of this film, that really was the way in for me for the book. And originally I had a really long, basically like a transcript of this whole film. And I was obsessed with it. And I typed it out word for word, and I tried to describe every single scene and every shift in that film. And so it was a much longer version than is now in the book. And in a way that, you know, that process stands as a kind of like little microcosm of the process of the whole writing, which is, you know, producing like a lot of material and then having to do this painstaking process of editing down and trying to sharpen in my own mind what it is that I think I'm exploring. And I like to read books where I feel I'm in contact with a mind and a person trying to figure something out. And I like watching that process happen. And in my own writing, I feel like that's what is alive for me, is trying to clarify something for myself And whether I achieved that, I don't know, but that's the kind of painful, but, you know, in some painful way, satisfying kind of process that writing is, this weird, hellish thing that we obsess over.
Yeah, I was guessing that, and I think there's a way that you at times there's so many texts that you reference in the book, but sometimes there'll be just say like one quick quote from a book, but I can tell that the analysis of the book or your relationship to it still remains present. And so I wonder, do you want to talk a little more about that? Because there's so many sources in a way, but it's not done in a traditional way. I mean, sometimes it is where there'll be like, you know, let's say Foucault or something. There's like, you know, it's more focused because the title draws from that. Some of the texts come in and out. But then sometimes it will literally just be one quote. And so I wanted to, if you wanted to share a little bit more about how you're able to narrow it down. What was the guiding principle, or how did you know, like, this is the one quote I want, you know?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I'm a real kind of rereader of various things. There are texts that I get quite sort of obsessed with, and I read them over and over again, and it almost becomes like a sort of like a chorus of kind of voices that I feel are sort of accompanying me and helping me to think with, you know. I mean, Michel Foucault says this about Nietzsche. He says that the point, like the use of Nietzsche for Foucault was precisely to kind of to use Nietzsche's thought in order to kind of distort it and change it and move it around and sort of play with it. And I think that, you know, especially if you're kind of trained in some sort of scholarly way, you feel very mindful of being like respectful of your sources and being really precise in citation and making sure you attribute your ideas. And I try to do that really clearly in the book, because I think that, you know, a lot of the ideas in the book are part of this whole, you know, conversation within feminist theory and queer theory. And I want to really kind of pay homage to that. But I also feel that I use thinkers to think with, and that's sort of what we're all doing. You know, there's a community of exploration and curiosity that we're all as writers engaged in. And sometimes it will just be one sentence that will haunt me for like years, decades, until it kind of finds its place in the book. So again, you know, it's very slow and circuitous.
Well, I love the shape of the book, because I think it kind of starts with a critique or a series of examinations about political, structural, societal, and personal boundaries around sex and sexuality and sensibility. And then it ends in a somewhat different place with kind of an invocation, or maybe not a different place, but actually in some ways it ends where it starts, as I'm sure you know, but as a kind of an invocation of vulnerability as a path toward desire. And you ask whether sexual ethics can expand beyond the conversation about consent that I think we're probably most of us are familiar with, but can also include all of these other, you know, aspects like conversation and mutual exploration and curiosity, uncertainty, porousness, malleability. And I think in a way you're opening up the possibility that these multitudes, right, that these uncertainties might offer a broader or more wide-ranging path toward joy. Would you say that's the sort of path that that you're after?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, the kind of like the argumentative and sort of narrative arc of the book in a way is, yeah, you know, it starts off with this kind of exploration of how how much consent has been the sort of dominant language in which we try and understand the difficulties of sex. And obviously, you know, consent is absolutely the bare minimum for sex, and, you know, consent education is hugely important. But the book sort of starts with an exploration of why the language around consent actually can't capture the sort of texture of what it is to negotiate risk and desire. And, you know, I do a sort of critique of the way in which I think that we have kind of contracted out our sort of political thinking onto this legal language in a way that I don't think does women or anyone any favors, because it really emphasizes this a kind of pressure on women to know what they want in the first place, and to be able to express confidently and clearly their sexual desire in order to keep themselves safe from sexual violence. And, you know, my argument is that that is holding women up to a kind of impossible ideal. And if they fail to reach that ideal, which they inevitably will, the onus and the blame comes back on them in terms of, you know, any kind of redress for sexual violence. So it starts with this kind of critique of how overly invested in the language of consent we are, when in fact we should be kind of, you know, steering our gaze to this realm of kind of good and bad sex, and what makes good and bad sex possible. And some of that is to do with not kind of stigmatizing vulnerability. And it's very complicated because, you know, the things that as individuals we all do to manage the risk of violence that's out there in the world, that is not to be, you know, dismissed. It's an absolutely overwhelming kind of rubric through which we experience and understand the world we live in. We manage that risk in all kinds of ways, including kind of, you know, defining our boundaries really starkly to kind of ward off the risk of violence. But what I want to suggest is that while that is a strategic position we might take in order to manage that risk, we should be kind of hoping and aiming and demanding more in terms of how we think about sexual life, but also how we think about what it is to be a person, because we are all vulnerable. Everyone is vulnerable in sex, men included. You know, the perpetrators of sexual violence are also vulnerable. And part of the problem is that violence comes out of this denial of vulnerability and sort of malleability. So in a way, you know, there is a kind of utopian argument in the book, which isn't to say that, you know, we should all sort of throw away all the kind of understandable strategies we take in managing risk. But I'm trying to, you know, open up a space where we could say, let's raise our hopes without disregarding the very real fears that we have encountering violence in the world. So, you know, it's a very kind of delicate kind of tightrope argument I've made. And if, you know, I might lose my balance any moment.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, there's a point in the book where you have this quote where you say, bad sex is a political issue, one of inequality of access to pleasure and self-determination. And it is as a political issue that we should be examining it, which I think is a challenge to this notion that bad sex is a cultural rite of passage that I think, you know, so many of us are familiar with. And I wonder, what would it mean to examine bad sex as a political issue?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, I should also say that lots of people are doing precisely that, right? You know, loads of people who are working in consent education and in sex education and in all kinds of, you know, attempts to loosen norms of gender are doing precisely that work. And I think that, you know, a lot of it is, I think, to do with the availability of sex education and the availability of sex education early. And I think that, you know, at the moment, what we tend to have is narratives around sexuality that, first of all, you know, prioritize male pleasure, male desire, you know, heterosexual male pleasure and desire. And at the same time, totally normalize the idea that, you know, sex for women is much more difficult and, you know, much more riddled with pain. And we find it really hard to talk to women and about women, and young women especially, about sexual pleasure. And I think, in fact, one of the reasons that the conversation gets so loaded onto consent is partly because it's a way to avoid talking about pleasure. So I think there are so many kind of strategies that are needed, some of which are also kind of socioeconomic. Like, if women or if people are vulnerable because they're dependent on somebody for, to not be reported to immigration, or they're dependent on people for, their next paycheck, or for their housing security, or whatever it might be, all those things are playing into the kind of imbalances of power that create bad sex. And, fundamentally, it's also about our norms of masculinity and femininity that, regardless of the fact that, like, questions of gender are really, being shaken up in really exciting and important ways, there is still this overriding notion of masculinity as to do with control and, dominating others and not being able to show any kind of weakness in your armor. And I'm trying to say in the book that vulnerability should not be a ground for anybody being abused, and that there is also pleasure in vulnerability, which is why it's very fraught, because we have to be vulnerable in order to be able to explore our sexuality, and in order to enjoy it, and in order to experience any physical pleasure. And of course, that makes us vulnerable to violence as well. But I'm trying to refuse the step whereby vulnerability itself becomes kind of stigmatized, and where we have to define women's sexuality in such a way that it will be immune to abuse, because sexuality shouldn't have to be immune to abuse in order for women not to be abused. Like, the onus should be on our kind of collective social ethics rather than sexuality itself, because sexuality is vulnerable. And that, I think, is where we need to start from, rather than kind of close down the conversation.
Yeah, I love it when you say toward the end of the book that vulnerability can be a form of care, right? So I feel like the book is kind of moving toward this holistic idea of what care can be, and I think it kind of circle back to one thing you were saying. I really like in the book, there are so many places where you just have these really succinct statements that that are so they expand in so many different directions. Like, sometimes they just seem like, oh, of course, that's totally obvious, but they're not actually obvious, right? It's just that's the development of the prose, and of the narrative that you're creating, or the multiple narratives. And one of those, some of those, we've addressed. And another one, I thought, you say men hate women so they don't have to hate themselves, right? And I felt like there's a certain point towards the beginning of the book where you have kind of a disclaimer where this book is centering around sex between men and women, because that's where I have the expertise, and I don't want to claim to speak for anyone else. And I think, but at the same time, there's a lot in the book that does apply, I think, more broadly, as I think you're speaking to right now. And I think that statement in particular, like, I immediately thought of gay male sexual culture that has the exact dynamic, but it's two people who are male socialized, or at least two people who are male socialized in the sexual encounter, hating the feminine, and anything that may seem weak or, deviating from the sort of stereotypical masculinity. And that sort of creates this kind of dehumanization, which creates, I think, which I think the logic that you're applying in your book, I think applies very well, in that realm. And I wondered, even if it's outside the scope of your book, what do you think about that? Because I think also, a lot of the book, you're sort of questioning Me Too in particular, right? And the sort of some of the simplistic rhetoric. And, you know, one example like you were just giving is, you know, when consent advocates say that self-knowledge is the way to prevent rape, right? And you say, oh, well, that's what Harvey Weinstein's lawyers say. So if that's the way to prevent rape, then, you know, maybe we're a little bit stuck, you know? And, but I think another thing that Me Too, that has become is a little bit overly simplistic is this kind of re-invocation of a very binary kind of feminism, where the violence is always between men and women, or always men as perpetrators, you know, exerting violence against women. And I would say, obviously, we live in a misogynist, patriarchal culture, and that violence is at this absolute center of every system of power, including, you know, from the structural to the intimate. But I wondered also about, because I think so much of your analysis is so precise that I do think it expands out from there. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about bringing this analysis, you know, into other realms, you know, where it's not just sex between men and women.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think, you know, I think you're right that, you know, the Me Too conversations that happened from 2017 or 18 onwards, I can't remember the date, you know, there was this kind of danger that, you know, that what was a kind of well-meaning attempt, and I think, you know, an important attempt to bring accountability, you know, to hold powerful men who abuse their power to account, that it ended, the risk is that it was ending up kind of totally reifying this idea of, you know, men as monsters and women as kind of innocent or pure or something. And, you know, it's, again, it's so tricky, isn't it? Because, like, you know, men are the majority of perpetrators of sexual violence by far. And, you know, women are susceptible, hugely susceptible to that violence, but not just women. I mean, men who, you know, deviate from the kind of standard traditional norms of masculinity are hugely vulnerable to male violence, as are trans women, trans men, you know, anyone who is kind of deviating from that kind of very hierarchical regime of gender is at risk from violence, gendered violence and sexual violence from men. And in the book, you know, I was trying to look at, you know, as you say, like very precisely at how we think about these questions of power between men and women having sex with one another. But because I think that those dynamics are so informed, I mean, just overwhelmingly informed by notions of masculinity that have to constantly be reasserted, you know, even in the sex research that I talk about in the middle section of the book, these, you know, these attempts to kind of find out how we can, you know, sexually liberate women and how we can sort of finally, you know, find the truth about sexuality that will lead to this kind of utopian tomorrow. Even in that research, I think there's a kind of very deep motivation to find out the difference between men and women. You know, a lot of that research is unconsciously motivated by this very, very binary system. And because I think that, you know, violence is about power and it's about feelings of humiliation that have to be kind of passed on and feelings of shame that have to be ejected from oneself onto someone else, I think that those conversations in the book, they apply so much across the board, you know, whether we're talking about relationships, you know, between men, sexual relationships between men, or, you know, relationships of violence between different kinds of identities or communities. It's, you know, the motor behind that is this kind of fear, I think, of that which is deemed weak and distasteful, which tends to be the feminine. And, you know, Jonathan Kemp wrote this brilliant book called The Penetrated Male that looked really beautifully at this interaction between kind of misogyny and hostility towards, you know, the receiver in gay sex. And I think these things merge so much you know, the links in the chain between these different forms of violence are so present. But, you know, as you said in the book, because I wanted to, partly for my own reasons, because I have sex with men, and I'm fascinated and haunted by all this material in my own life. I wanted to kind of that to be the primary lens of the book, but to acknowledge that, you know, what I have to say about these relationships and the failure of the public languages we have around power and consent and desire. I think those failures affect everyone, and I should say I think they affect everyone negatively, including straight men. I don't think straight men are served well by a kind of model of sexuality which is about you know, this management of your kind of bounded self that you have to protect at all costs. But, you know, sex is about a transaction where you get to acquire something from somebody else, and where the stakes are so high for straight men that if they fail in that endeavor, it's catastrophic. The humiliation is so catastrophic that they have to commit violence. So everyone is the victim, I think, of these norms.
Yeah, and I think in the book, oh, I should say, if anyone has questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. Anything you want to ask, just throw it there. We'll get to them. Yeah, I think in the book, you do such a great job of talking about the slipperiness of desire rather than its fixed, you know, status, right? Or the idea that it's fixed, you know, because you know, desire, it turns on and off without our consent all the time, right? So we can't, you know, hold it to the strict standard, right? And, you know, it surprises us, it lets us down. And I love how you open up the space for, as you say, not knowing what you want, you know, in a sexual encounter. And at one point you say we shouldn't have to know ourselves. I think you just referenced this in a way, but we shouldn't have to know ourselves in order to be safe from violence. And then also a little later you say that this would hold sexuality hostage to violence. And I thought that was like such a really interesting reframing because I think we're told in a way the opposite, right? That if there's a fixed set of, you know, this is what I am going to do, this is what I'm not going to do, this is what I want, this is what I don't want, and it's always the same, everyone knows at all times. Now that can be useful in certain settings. Certainly, like if, you know, the terms are transactional, you know, in like sex work, you know, or if there's, you know, the possibility of physical harm or, you know, accident if everything isn't super precise, like in an SM scene. But in a broader context, I really like the way that you're reframing what it means to be held hostage to violence. And I wonder if you want to talk a little more about that reframing.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's so important that we preserve a distinction between consent and desire or pleasure or enthusiasm, precisely because there's all kinds of transactional sex that where we need to have a very, you know, clear sense that there's an agreement that could be violated in order to protect people. So, you know, sex workers primarily, but also in order to kind of get at the distinction between good sex and bad sex. There needs to be a meaningful distinction, because people agree to sex all the time that turns out really badly for them and leaves them feeling in pain, humiliated, you know, objectified, all kinds of things. And so agreement is just agreement. we must not conflate agreement with all these other kind of states that might be states that we would like ideally to experience in sex, you know, enjoyment and pleasure and enthusiasm and all of that. But so on the question of desire, where it gets, I think, you know, really tricky and kind of rich, is that I think I think often we tend to feel that that if we can find out our desire and then clearly express it to somebody else, that is what is going to make us safe. And sometimes that may be true, as you say, sometimes you need to delineate your boundaries and your desires very clearly. But what I don't want to do is to kind of buckle to that equation, because I think that, desire changes all the time. And, good models of consent acknowledge this, right? That, you don't just give consent once and for all. It's constantly ongoing. Your desire, stops and starts. But I think there's really important things to think about to do with how desire is relational. And actually, you talk about this so beautifully in The Freezer Door. There's that amazing bit where you say, when someone else's desire is what makes me feel mine, does this mean this is someone else's desire? And I think that's a thing that I think feminism has real trouble kind of wrestling with, which is the kind of mimetic nature of desire. We desire in relation to other people. Other people can elicit our desire. Context can elicit our desire. And so what do we do with that? Does that mean it's not ours? I sort of want to get away from this model where, we're these kind of really walled in, separate beings who can find out what we want. And then we take this knowledge kind of as armor out in the world to experience pleasure and to be protected. And I want to resist that model, because I think it works against women, because if we have to know ourselves and express that knowledge clearly in order to be safe from violence, we will fail. And then what happens? What happens is that we then get blamed for violence that is done towards us. So I'm really interested in how we think with the fact that desire is, a kind of cyclical and often interactive process, partly because that's just who we are as creatures. None of us would actually be alive if desire wasn't mimetic in that way, because we wouldn't have been fed and we wouldn't have elicited the care of our caregivers. So we are all in this kind of cycle of, mutually fulfilling desire. But also, given that women live in this really punitive sexual culture, maybe it's unsurprising that sometimes women's desire has to be elicited in different ways, because the world just does not cater for women's desire in the right ways. It doesn't elicit it. It doesn't encourage it. And in fact, what it does is something really paradoxical, which is demand women's sexual desire, be the assertive, confident, consent-giving woman. But actually that desire may come back to haunt you. It may be read out from a text message in a rape trial to prove that you weren't raped. So how do we use that kind of responsive relational aspect of desire without endangering women? And I think, the key is to acknowledge that all desire is relational, and that shouldn't make us targets of violence. It's a condition of human life, so we can't deny it. We have to work with it.
Oh, I love that. And I love, I think even though our books are so different, The Freezer Door and your book, I think they are in conversation. So I love that you pulled that quote from it. I see we have some questions coming in, so I won't talk too much at the moment. So here's a question from Sailor Holiday. This is fantastic, thank you. Wondering what you have to say about connections between bottoming and being a wage worker. Just thinking about, how do we have a liberatory sexual interaction under capitalism? Okay, we're getting big.
Well, I think it's very difficult. I mean, it's the crushing weight on all of us, isn't it? And that's where, I think it's a kind of really rich space, this question of kind of transactional sex, because it sometimes gets invoked as a way to characterize like everything that is wrong with, wrong with the world, is that there's transactional sex, and I don't think that's the case. I think transactions can be good, and transactions can be really important to protect people. So, I feel that when it comes to kind of, if I've understood your question rightly about, you said, was it waged sex work? Was that the phrase?
They were actually just asking for wage work in general, but I think
Right,
sex work is a
okay.
great example.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, you know, I think it would be really great if we had universal basic income, because people are made vulnerable in sex, at least partly because they are dependent on someone else for a roof over their heads and for the next meal and for the sake, you know, some kind of home in which to rear their children. You know, obviously in the pandemic, it's been so kind of horribly sobering to think about this idea of, you know, the home as the kind of safe space, like, you know, stay at home and be safe, you know, when the home is actually the place of most violence against women and children. So I think that, you know, when we're talking about these conversations about consent and sexual violence, a lot of the time it becomes a very individual focused conversation where we, you know, the consent rhetoric itself sometimes inadvertently places again this burden on individual women to manage the risk and be confident and make sure that they don't get assaulted. I mean, I'm phrasing it in a slightly glib way. I don't think that's a conscious part of the consent rhetoric, but I think it has internalized that kind of neoliberal individual risk management approach to all life. And you know, part of why we need to resist that kind of individual focus on these things is because for so many women, the conditions of their sex lives are overwhelmingly informed by their precarity, their socioeconomic vulnerability. And if we could address that, then we would address, you know, the women who are living in terror of their partners, who they agree to sex with because they have no other choice. So you know, I really think it's important to kind of put together that kind of more individual focus on what, you know, what we all need to do and how we can all try to manage this, you know, violent world with concrete sort of social policies that might actually help liberate women rather than, you know, a kind of a rhetoric around sexual pleasure that is actually about making individual women responsible for their own safety. I want us collectively to think about the ethics of sex and how we can make the world safer for women, and overwhelmingly not to make them feel that only if they are this kind of, you know, very sex positive, confident, assertive woman are they entitled to safe sex. Everybody should be entitled to sex that is consensual and pleasurable. You shouldn't have to be a particular kind of person to do that, and nor should you be a particular kind of demographic. So, you know, so I'm always trying to think about how to put that kind of more collective question together with how we all have to like individually cope with this crazy fucked up world that we live in. I hope that answers your question more or less.
Yeah, and I think that actually connects to the next question pretty well. The next question I'm going to try to condense because I think there's a lot of material. So I'm gonna, yes. So this is from Renee Barra. You addressed how feminist theory has a kind of double bind. And we see this with young female sexual education, where old tropes of girls as weak and need of protection and reprogramming and fragility is reaffirmed. What do you think is an anecdote to this problematic relationship girls are given? Oh, I think they mean antidote. What do you think is an antidote to this problematic relationship girls are given to self-power and sexual agency?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it's such a, I keep thinking about this kind of tightrope that I feel I'm walking, because I think it's and not just me. I mean, I think that, you know, as women living in the world, it's, you know, that's the problem. It's kind of constantly walking on this tightrope. On the one hand, you want to you know, you want to educate girls and women in the risks of the world, the dangers in the world, the fact that their sexual curiosity will be used against them, the fact that, you know, statistically they're very likely to encounter harassment and sexual bullying and violence. But how to do that without without completely closing down the possibilities for sexual exploration and pleasure. I often think about this quote by the theorist, I don't know how to pronounce her surname, Anne Snitov. I never know how she says her name, but she has written about her kind of decades in activism, in feminism and sexual violence. And she talks about the task being to try to, to really bring to mind the kind of, overwhelming presence of sexual violence and to address it, but without terrifying ourselves. And she says, tough trick. And I think that's the real difficulty, is that when we're trying to kind of protect women from sexual violence and protect girls from sexual violence, protection is a really double-edged thing, because if you protect somebody from danger, you can also be protecting them from freedom or exploration. And the threat of sexual violence is, it's a fact in the world, but it's also a narrative that women are flooded with. We're saturated with the awareness of sexual violence. Think of all the countless TV shows, police and detective shows that have to begin with, a mutilated woman's body, and where the narratives of so many tropes in our culture are about warning women that, if you enjoy yourself too much, or if you have lots of sexual partners, or if you pursue your pleasure, really bad stuff is going to come your way. And so I'm very kind of mindful of the way in which how we talk about sexual violence can also be used against women to frighten them into pure terror, but also can be used by people who want to control women's movements. It's very convenient. The fact of sexual violence is very convenient to people who want women to stay in one place and not to experience their own capacity for enjoyment and agency. So I think, I don't have a kind of solution to this. If I did, the world would be a much better place. But, the trick is to take sexual violence really seriously, but to not use it as a pretext to make girls and women feel guilty about their own desire for sexual exploration. And I think that is such a difficult thing to do. And usually the way it turns out is that we don't talk to young girls about their right to pleasure, and then their sexuality is, flooded with a sense of kind of pure negativity. But if we took pleasure seriously in girls, then we might stand a better chance of a sexual culture where their low expectations weren't pitted against the kind of entitlement that men feel to women's bodies, regardless of whether women are enjoying themselves.
Well, I'm noticing we're getting close to the end of the hour. So what I want to do is to invite people to flood the comments with your appreciation for Katherine's brilliant commentary, and also, of course, click the link to order the book. One thing maybe this is a good ending. I'm not sure. It's a question you asked, and I won't demand that you ask it because that you answer it, because it might be a good ending, or feel free to answer it if you want. But you asked, how can sex matter less so it can yield more? That's one of those very simple statements that I think is so rich and so evocative, and I think could give us all a lot to think about.
Yeah, sex is hugely important. How can we prioritize and, account for the importance of it, the beauty of it, the richness of it, without that then becoming its own tyranny that makes its failure unbearable? The failure of sexual power for men is so unbearable, they kill women in the name of it. So how can we enjoy sex without it mattering to us quite so much that we're prepared to commit violence to one another? I don't know. That's my aim.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation and for this brilliant book. And Maris, to send us off.
Yeah, thank you both for a really wonderful conversation. Once more, please buy the book. Thank you so much, Katherine and Mattilda.
Thank
Have a great
you.
night.
Thank you. It was a thrill. I'm such a fan of Mattilda, so it was like a dream come true.
Oh, thank you. I hope this is the first of many wonderful conversations.
Yes, me too.